At exactly 11:58 p.m., Dorothy Thompson stood beneath a flickering bus stop light outside Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport, staring at the last $8 in her wallet. The same $8 that would keep the electricity on for her son one more day. Then, a trembling stranger rushed toward her, begging for exactly $8 to reach the hospital before his daughter's emergency surgery. Everyone turned away. Dorothy hesitated, tightened her grip on her late mother's old thermos, then placed every dollar into his shaking hand, and quietly gave him the thermos too. 6 hours later, at exactly 6:00 a.m., an unknown number shattered the silence of her dark apartment. Before we continue, I'd love to know where you're watching from and what your local time is right now. If stories about kindness, courage, and second chances speak to your heart, consider subscribing and joining our growing community. This story is only just beginning. At 8:15 every evening, while most apartment windows in Dorothy Thompson's neighborhood glowed with families finishing dinner, she quietly zipped up her navy blue janitorial jacket and kissed her son on the forehead before leaving for work. It was the same routine 6 nights a week. "Ethan, your lunch is in the second shelf. Don't forget your spelling test tomorrow." "I won't, Mom." "The oatmeal is already made. Just warm it." "I know." She smiled, brushing a curl away from his forehead. "You always know." Their apartment sat on the 3rd floor of a weathered building in West Phoenix. The paint around the windows had begun peeling years ago. The air conditioner groaned every afternoon as though it was arguing with the Arizona heat. The refrigerator hummed loudly enough to become part of the silence. It wasn't much, but Dorothy insisted it always smelled clean. She believed that poverty and dignity had never been enemies. Dirt was free. Cleanliness was a choice. Before locking the door behind her, she glanced toward the kitchen counter. A folded utility bill waited there beneath a ceramic sugar bowl. "Past due. Amount remaining $8. Final notice. Service interruption scheduled Thursday. Tomorrow." She looked at the paper for only a second before slipping it into her purse. There was no point staring at numbers she already knew by heart. $8. Exactly 8. She had repeated the figure so many times over the past week that it had become strangely unreal. If she paid it, the lights stayed on. If she didn't. She refused to imagine Ethan waking before school in a dark apartment. Outside the desert, evening had begun cooling. Dorothy climbed into her faded, silver 2007 Honda Civic, whose dashboard lights worked only when they felt like it. The driver's seat had a tear stitched together by her own careful hands, using thick black thread. She started the engine. The radio remained silent. She preferred it that way. Silence gave her room to think. 25 minutes later, she parked in the employee lot at Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. Millions of travelers passed through the airport every year. Very few noticed the people who cleaned it after midnight. Dorothy was one of them. At precisely 10:00 p.m., she clocked in, tied her identification badge around her neck, pulled on blue gloves, and began wiping fingerprints from glass doors that would be covered again within minutes. She emptied overflowing trash bins. She polished stainless steel railings. She mopped endless stretches of polished floor until they reflected the bright ceiling lights like still water. Passengers hurried by dragging expensive luggage. Business executives spoke into wireless earbuds. Families argued over boarding gates. Children laughed. Couples reunited. Hardly anyone looked at the woman quietly cleaning around them. Dorothy had grown used to invisibility. Invisible people learned things others missed. She noticed the exhausted nurse asleep against gate B14, the Marine kissing his daughter before deployment, the elderly couple sharing one sandwich because they thought nobody was watching. The airport told thousands of stories every night. Dorothy simply happened to clean between them. Around midnight, she always stopped for exactly 7 minutes. Not 6, not 8, 7. She carried a worn stainless steel thermos that had lost most of its silver finish years ago. Small scratches covered its surface. The handle had been replaced twice. Near the bottom, barely visible beneath years of use, someone had scratched 2 tiny letters. At Angela Thompson, her mother. Every evening before leaving home, Dorothy filled the thermos with fresh coffee. But she never filled only 1 cup. Always 2. Every single night. New employees often asked why. "You expecting company?" She usually smiled. "Maybe." They laughed. She never explained. Years earlier, when Dorothy was only 16, Angela had worked double shifts at a nursing home. Money had always been scarce. One icy January morning, Dorothy watched her mother pour coffee into 2 paper cups before leaving home. "Mom," she'd asked, "why make 2? It's just us." Angela had smiled without looking up. "Because one day someone colder than me might need it." "But what if nobody does?" Her mother gently placed the 2nd cup beside the first. "Then I'll drink both." Dorothy remembered laughing. Angela had looked at her with soft brown eyes. Then she'd said something Dorothy never forgot. "Warm hands make brave hearts." At 16, Dorothy hadn't understood. Years later, after cancer took her mother far too early, those words became something far bigger than advice. They became a promise. Every night since Dorothy filled enough coffee for 2 people. Most nights she drank both cups herself before sunrise. Some nights, she didn't. At 1:20 a.m., Dorothy pushed her cleaning cart into Terminal 3. Her coworker, Rosa Martinez, waved from across the hallway. "You still carrying that old thermos?" Dorothy laughed. "It still keeps coffee warm." "Barely. It keeps memories warmer." Rosa grinned. "You always say things like that." "My mother did." They continued working. The night settled into its familiar rhythm. The airport slowly grew quieter. Announcements echoed farther. Cleaning machines hummed through empty corridors. Somewhere beyond the giant windows, airplanes lifted into the darkness one after another. At 2:45 a.m., Dorothy found a little stuffed rabbit lying beneath a row of seats. She picked it up carefully. Someone's child would surely come back looking for it. She placed it inside Lost and Found. She whispered softly, "I hope you find your way home." No one heard her. That didn't matter. At 3:30 a.m., she sat alone near an employee hallway and unscrewed the lid of her thermos. Steam curled gently into the cool air. She poured herself 1 cup. Then she poured the second into another paper cup. The 2nd cup sat untouched beside her, exactly as it always did. She smiled faintly. "Still waiting, Mom." She took 1 slow sip. The coffee had become less about caffeine and more about remembering the woman who had taught her that kindness should never wait until life became comfortable. Comfort had a habit of arriving too late. When her break ended, Dorothy tossed away the empty paper cup she had used. The 2nd remained untouched. She carefully poured it back into the thermos. Perhaps someone would still need it before sunrise. At 4:40 a.m., her phone vibrated. A text message from Ethan. "Good luck tonight, Mom. I left you half my granola bar. Love you." Dorothy smiled so warmly that another janitor noticed. "Everything okay?" "My son's reminding me he's growing up." She slipped the phone back into her pocket. She didn't mention that Ethan often divided his own snacks in half because he believed sharing somehow made food last longer. He had learned that from watching her. At 5:15 a.m., Dorothy opened her wallet while buying a discounted bottle of water from an employee vending machine. Inside were only 4 bills, 1 $5 bill, 3 $1 bills. Nothing else. She counted them once, then again. Exactly $8. Enough to keep the lights on, or enough to change someone else's night. She had no idea that before another hour passed, those same $8 would become the smallest amount of money she had ever given away, and the most valuable decision she would ever make. Dorothy Thompson clocked out at exactly 11:42 p.m. She always noticed the time before removing her employee badge. It was another habit inherited from her mother, who believed that paying attention to ordinary moments kept people from sleepwalking through life. The airport employee corridor was nearly empty. Most of the retail shops had already closed, and only the distant sound of rolling suitcases echoed through the polished halls. Dorothy slipped her badge into her purse, picked up her worn thermos, and adjusted the strap of her canvas tote bag. Her body ached. Not from one dramatic injury, from repetition. Thousands of floors mopped, thousands of trash bags lifted, thousands of nights spent while the rest of the city slept. Outside the employee exit, the desert air surprised her. Although Phoenix was famous for blistering heat, late autumn nights sometimes carried an unexpected chill. A steady wind swept across the nearly empty parking lots, sending dry leaves skittering over the pavement. Dorothy zipped her jacket higher. Her old Honda refused to start. She turned the key once. Nothing. Again. Only a tired, clicking sound. She rested both hands on the steering wheel. "Please," she whispered. The car answered with silence. She leaned back and closed her eyes. Repairing the starter wasn't an option. Not tonight. Not with $8 left. She gathered her belongings, locked the car, and began the 15-minute walk toward the city bus stop, just outside the airport entrance. The streets were unusually quiet. A few airport shuttles passed. An occasional taxi disappeared into the darkness. The neon lights from nearby hotels painted long reflections across the sidewalk. Dorothy walked quickly. If she caught the Route 13 bus, she'd still be home before Ethan woke up. If she missed it, she would have to wait another hour. Halfway there, she noticed a young airport security officer helping an elderly traveler lift 2 heavy suitcases into a shuttle. The old woman smiled with relief. Dorothy smiled too. Kindness had a way of making strangers feel less alone, even when they weren't the ones receiving it. She reached the bus shelter just as the Route 13 bus pulled away. Its brake lights glowed red for only a moment before disappearing into the distance. Dorothy exhaled slowly. So much for perfect timing. She wasn't angry. Being angry required energy she no longer had. The electronic display above the shelter flashed, "Next bus, 12:31 a.m., 42 minutes." She sat down on the cold metal bench. The shelter was almost empty. A college student wearing headphones stared at his phone. A delivery driver slept with his backpack against his chest, and a woman in business clothes paced while arguing softly through a Bluetooth headset. Everyone existed inside their own private world. Dorothy unscrewed the lid of her thermos. Warm steam drifted upward. She poured herself half a cup. The familiar aroma reminded her of home, of Angela, of mornings before life became complicated. She lifted the cup toward her lips, then stopped. The second cup. She had almost forgotten. Smiling to herself, she poured another serving into the empty paper cup she always carried. Both cups rested beside her. One for herself, one for whoever might need it. The second cup sat untouched, just as always. A gust of wind swept through the shelter. The businessman glanced at the coffee but quickly looked away. The college student never raised his eyes from his screen. The delivery driver continued sleeping. Dorothy quietly drank from her own cup. Nearly 10 minutes passed. Then she heard footsteps. Fast. Uneven. Someone was running. A man appeared from the direction of the airport parking garage. He looked to be in his early 60s. His gray overcoat was expensive but wrinkled. His tie hung loose around his neck. One dress shoe was untied. His breathing came in sharp, uneven bursts. He stopped in front of the shelter, turning in circles as though searching for someone. Then he reached into every pocket of his coat. Left pocket. Right pocket. Inside jacket pocket. Back pockets. Again. 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 His face slowly drained of color. "No." He whispered it more to himself than anyone else. "No. No, please." The businesswoman frowned. The college student finally looked up. The delivery driver opened one sleepy eye. The older man hurried toward the bench. Has anyone seen a black leather wallet?" Nobody answered. "I had it 10 minutes ago." Still silence. He looked around desperately before pulling out his phone. Its battery died before he could finish dialing. The screen went black. For several seconds, he simply stared at it. Then something inside him seemed to collapse. He lowered himself onto the opposite end of Dorothy's bench. His hands trembled. Dorothy noticed something most people probably wouldn't have. His fingernails were clean. His wedding ring had left a pale mark on his finger, though the ring itself was gone. There was a hospital visitor sticker stuck crookedly to the sleeve of his coat. The time printed on it read 11:07 p.m. He wasn't pretending to have come from a hospital. He actually had. The businessman beside Dorothy sighed impatiently. "You should call the police. My phone's dead. Borrow somebody's." The older man hesitated. "I don't remember any numbers." The businesswoman rolled her eyes. "Seriously?" He nodded weakly. "I always relied on my contacts." She shrugged. "That's unfortunate." Then she walked several steps away. Dorothy watched the man's shoulders sag. He looked less like someone asking for help and more like someone ashamed to need it. Several minutes passed before he finally spoke again. His voice barely carried above the wind. "I'm sorry." Nobody responded. "I'm not asking for much." Still nothing. "I just need $8. The words caught Dorothy's attention immediately. $8. Not 10, not 20, exactly 8. The businessman laughed under his breath. "That's specific." The older man nodded. "The night bus to Mercy Regional Hospital costs $8. He swallowed hard. "My daughter," his voice cracked. "She's having emergency heart surgery." Nobody moved. "I drove here after getting the call." He rubbed both hands over his face. "My wallet must have fallen somewhere between the parking garage and the terminal." He looked at each person one by one. "I just need to get back." Silence. The businesswoman shook her head. "People make up stories like this every day." "I'm not lying." "They all say that." The college student quietly stood up and moved farther away. The delivery driver pretended to fall asleep again. Within seconds, the shelter had become emotionally empty, even though everyone was still physically present. Dorothy felt her heartbeat quicken. $8. Her fingers instinctively touched her purse. Inside lay the folded utility bill. $8 stood between light and darkness in her apartment. She could already picture Ethan waking before sunrise. Could she really risk it? The older man stared at the pavement. "I'm sorry for asking." His voice had become almost inaudible. "I know how this looks." He slowly stood as if preparing to continue walking, despite having nowhere to go. A violent gust of wind swept through the shelter. The paper cup sitting beside Dorothy tipped over. Coffee spilled across the bench. Only a few drops remained. The old thermos, however, was still nearly full. Dorothy remembered another cold night years earlier. Angela had wrapped both hands around a paper cup before handing it to a homeless woman outside a grocery store. Young Dorothy had whispered, "But that's your coffee." Angela smiled. "Not anymore." The memory came so suddenly it almost felt like her mother was sitting beside her. Warm hands make brave hearts. Dorothy closed her eyes. Then she opened her wallet. One $5 bill. 3 $1 bills. Every dollar she had left. She held them for several long seconds. The wind fluttered the edges of the bills. She could almost hear the electric company notice crinkling inside her purse. Then she stood. Sir. The older man turned slowly. She walked toward him. Without saying another word, she placed all $8 into his shaking hand. His eyes widened. You don't even know me. No, Dorothy answered softly. But I know what desperation looks like. He stared at the money as though it weighed far more than paper should. Before he could speak again, Dorothy unscrewed the lid of her thermos. It's going to be a long ride. She handed it to him. My mother always said warm hands make brave hearts. The man accepted it with trembling fingers. For a moment, neither of them spoke. He looked as though he wanted to memorize her face. Then, in a voice barely stronger than a whisper, he said, I won't forget this. Dorothy wasn't sure whether she believed him. She simply hoped his daughter would live. As the bus headlights finally appeared in the distance, neither of them could have imagined that by sunrise, one phone call would change both of their lives forever. The bus doors folded open with a tired hiss. Samuel Walker climbed aboard, first clutching the old stainless steel thermos against his chest, as though it were something far more valuable than a container of coffee. Before stepping inside, he turned one last time. Dorothy was still standing beneath the flickering light. For a brief moment, their eyes met. He lifted the hand holding the thermos in a silent gesture of gratitude. Then the doors closed. The bus disappeared into the sleeping city. Dorothy remained at the stop for another few seconds, letting the silence settle around her. Only after the taillights vanished did she reach into her purse again. The wallet was empty. Not nearly empty. Empty. She smiled to herself, though her stomach tightened with uncertainty. Well, Mom, she whispered into the cool desert air, I finally found the second cup. She looked at the folded utility bill once more. $8. The number suddenly meant something completely different. She tucked the notice away before beginning the long walk home. Without a car and without another bus for nearly an hour, walking was her only choice. The streets of Phoenix felt strangely peaceful before dawn. Traffic lights changed for almost no one. A newspaper truck rumbled past. A bakery several blocks away had already started its ovens, filling the air with the faint smell of fresh bread. Dorothy smiled at the scent. It reminded her that while some people were ending their day, others were just beginning theirs. She crossed an overpass where airplanes climbed into the dark sky one after another. Each one carried people with destinations, plans, celebrations, vacations, reunions. She wondered what it felt like to buy a plane ticket without calculating whether it meant skipping groceries the following week. The thought came and went. Self-pity had never stayed with her very long. It demanded too much energy. Instead, she thought about Ethan. He would probably wake before she got home. He always tried to pretend he had just gotten out of bed. She always pretended to believe him. When Dorothy finally reached the apartment building, the eastern horizon had begun to soften into pale gray. The hallway lights flickered. Someone downstairs was already watching morning news, loud enough for the entire building to hear. She climbed 3 flights of stairs, each step heavier than the last. Her apartment door creaked softly as she unlocked it. Inside, everything was still. Almost. A faint light glowed beneath Ethan's bedroom door. Dorothy frowned. He should have been asleep. She quietly stepped inside. The little boy sat at the kitchen table, wearing mismatched socks and an oversized t-shirt. His spelling notebook lay open beside a bowl of oatmeal that had long gone cold. He looked up immediately. I tried to stay awake. She laughed gently. I can see that. I wanted to make breakfast before you got home. You made oatmeal. I burned the first one. She noticed another bowl soaking in the sink. So this is attempt number 2. He nodded proudly. This one's edible. Dorothy smiled. It smells perfect. He climbed down from the chair and hugged her tightly. She hugged him back a little longer than usual. Children often noticed changes adults tried to hide. After a few seconds, Ethan looked up. "You're cold." "I walked home." "What happened to the car?" "It decided it wanted another vacation." He giggled. "Again. Again." They laughed together. It was a small laugh, but it filled the apartment. Dorothy hung her jacket over a chair before instinctively reaching toward the counter where she normally placed the thermos. Her hand stopped halfway. The empty space startled her. For years, that old thermos had returned home with her every single morning. Now the counter looked strangely incomplete. Ethan noticed. "Where's Grandma's coffee bottle?" Dorothy hesitated. "I lent it to someone." "Will you get it back?" "I don't know." He studied her face carefully. "You helped somebody." It wasn't a question. She nodded. "I think they needed it more than I did." He was quiet for a moment. Then he simply said, "Grandma would have liked that." Dorothy felt a sudden sting behind her eyes. Angela had been gone for nearly 12 years, yet somehow she still found ways to speak through her grandson. They ate breakfast together, mostly oatmeal, half a banana, one granola bar split exactly in half, as always. Ethan pushed the larger piece toward his mother. "You take this." "No." "You walked home." "You have school." "You worked all night." She smiled. "We're negotiating over granola again." He grinned. "Maybe." In the end, they broke it into 2 equal pieces. Neither one mentioned that both were still hungry. After breakfast, Dorothy helped Ethan pack his backpack. Homework, library book, lunch, pencil case. Everything had its place. Angela had believed that organization created peace, even when life refused to cooperate. Dorothy had inherited that belief too. Just before Ethan left for school, he stopped at the front door. "Mom?" "Yes." "Did the man get where he needed to go?" Dorothy looked out the window towards the brightening sky. "I hope so." "I think he did." "What makes you think that?" Ethan shrugged. "You wouldn't have smiled like that if you thought he didn't." The apartment fell silent after he left. Dorothy finally allowed herself to exhale. She looked toward the utility bill still lying beneath the sugar bowl. She unfolded it. Past due, final notice. Service interruption scheduled today. She checked the clock. 5:47 a.m. Any time now. She walked from room to room. The refrigerator still hummed. The kitchen light still worked. The old air conditioner clicked softly. She knew it wouldn't last. She made peace with it. If the power went out, they'd manage. They always did. She sat on the worn sofa and removed her shoes. Her feet throbbed. Small blisters covered both heels. She leaned her head back and closed her eyes. For the first time since leaving the bus stop, doubt quietly slipped into her thoughts. What if the story hadn't been true? What if Samuel had lied? What if she had chosen a stranger over her own child? The questions arrived one after another. She didn't try to silence them. Kindness was rarely accompanied by certainty. If people waited until they knew everything, very little goodness would ever happen. She remembered Angela once telling her, "Trust isn't believing everyone tells the truth. Trust is deciding what kind of person you want to be, even when you don't know." Dorothy opened her eyes again. The clock now read 5:58 a.m. The apartment was completely still. Then her cell phone vibrated across the coffee table. Unknown number. Phoenix, Arizona. She frowned. Telemarketers rarely called before sunrise. Debt collectors usually called later. She let it ring once, twice, 3 times. It stopped. She released a slow breath. Probably nothing. Almost immediately it rang again. The same number, unknown. She picked it up but didn't speak first. A calm, familiar male voice answered. "Miss Thompson." Dorothy froze. She recognized the voice before she recognized the name attached to it. "This is Samuel Walker." For several seconds, she couldn't find any words. I wasn't sure you'd remember me. I couldn't forget you if I tried. His voice sounded steadier than it had only hours earlier, but she could hear exhaustion beneath it. My daughter made it into surgery in time. Dorothy closed her eyes. A wave of relief washed through her. Thank God. There are people I'd like you to meet. She frowned slightly. I don't understand. I know. A brief silence followed. Then Samuel continued. Would you be willing to come to Horizon Freight Logistics at 9 o'clock this morning? Dorothy looked around her tiny apartment. At the unpaid utility bill, at the cracked kitchen floor, at the clock now turning to exactly 6:00 a.m. I think you may have changed more lives tonight than you realize. The line went quiet. Dorothy stared at the phone in disbelief, unaware that this unexpected invitation was not the reward for her kindness, but the first step into a future she had never imagined possible. Dorothy Thompson remained seated on the edge of her worn sofa long after the call ended. The apartment was quiet again, but it no longer felt like the same silence. She glanced at the phone in her hand. Unknown numbers had never brought good news before. Usually they meant collection agencies, overdue bills, or automated reminders that she could not afford what she already knew she owed. This one had been different. Samuel Walker. His daughter had survived the surgery. He wanted her to come to Horizon Freight Logistics at 9 o'clock. Nothing more, nothing less. She replayed every word in her mind. There are people I'd like you to meet. The sentence sounded simple, almost ordinary, yet something about it refused to leave her thoughts. She stood and walked into the tiny kitchen. The electric kettle still worked. For now. She instinctively reached toward the cabinet where she kept ground coffee. Then she stopped. The old thermos was gone. For years she had begun every morning by rinsing it carefully before placing it beside the sink to dry. The empty spot on the counter felt strangely personal. It was as if a member of the family had gone away. She smiled faintly. I hope you're keeping somebody warm. The words escaped before she realized she had spoken them aloud. At 6:30, Ethan came running back into the apartment. I forgot my science folder. He rushed straight toward his bedroom before freezing in the hallway. Mom? Yes. You looked different. Dorothy laughed softly. I've been awake all night. No. He tilted his head. You look like you're thinking. She smiled. I probably am. He returned carrying a blue folder covered with dinosaur stickers. Was that the man from last night? Yes. Is his daughter okay? They finished the surgery. Ethan's face brightened. So she lived. We don't know everything yet. But she's alive. Dorothy nodded. She's alive. He smiled with the uncomplicated joy only children seemed capable of. I knew Grandma's coffee would help. Dorothy laughed through damp eyes. It wasn't the coffee. I think it was. Before leaving again, Ethan stopped beside her. You should go. Go where? Wherever that man invited you. She looked surprised. What if it's nothing? He shrugged. What if it's something? His school bus horn sounded outside. He waved and hurried downstairs. Dorothy stood by the window watching until the bus disappeared around the corner. Children often asked the simplest questions. What if it's something? She checked the time. 7:05. If she wanted to reach Horizon Freight by 9, she needed to leave within the hour. She owned only 2 decent outfits. One was already hanging to dry after laundry. The other was a navy blouse and gray slacks she had worn to church the previous Easter. She ironed the blouse carefully. The iron hissed with steam. For one uneasy moment, she wondered if the electricity would disappear before she finished. It didn't. She brushed her hair into a neat bun, applied the smallest touch of lipstick she had left, looked into the bathroom mirror. The woman staring back appeared tired. Dark circles framed her eyes. Tiny lines had begun forming around the corners of her smile years earlier than they should have. But she also saw something else. She still stood up straight. Angela had always insisted on that. Stand like life hasn't beaten you. Even when it has. Dorothy picked up her purse. The unpaid electric bill remained inside. She almost removed it, then left it there. Reality belonged with her. Outside, the Arizona sun had already begun warming the sidewalks. Her Honda still refused to start. She sighed, then walked to the nearest bus stop. 45 minutes later, she stood across the street from Horizon Freight Logistics. The building surprised her. She had expected glass towers and marble entrances. Instead, it looked practical. Large brick walls, loading docks, rows of delivery trucks, employees carrying clipboards instead of expensive briefcases. The sign above the entrance simply read, Horizon Freight. No unnecessary decoration. No display of wealth. Just work. Dorothy crossed the parking lot slowly. She almost turned around twice. What am I doing here? She wasn't dressed for corporate offices. She had no resume, no college degree, no reason to believe she belonged. Inside the reception area, a young receptionist looked up. Good morning? Good morning. May I help you? My name is Dorothy Thompson. The receptionist smiled almost immediately. We've been expecting you. Dorothy blinked. You have? Mr. Walker asked that you be brought upstairs as soon as you arrived. Her heartbeat quickened. The receptionist handed her a visitor badge. Third floor. An elevator carried Dorothy upward. The ride lasted less than 30 seconds. It felt much longer. When the doors opened, she found herself in a quiet hallway lined with framed photographs. Old black and white pictures showed warehouse workers from decades earlier. Truck drivers, dispatchers, forklift operators, not executives. Workers. Dorothy noticed that immediately. At the end of the hallway stood Samuel Walker. He looked entirely different from the desperate man she had met only hours before. Freshly shaved, clean suit, polished shoes. Yet the exhaustion remained around his eyes. The moment he saw Dorothy, he walked toward her. Instead of offering a handshake, he simply said, "My daughter is awake." Dorothy smiled with genuine relief. "I'm so glad." "So am I." For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Samuel reached into a leather satchel resting beside his chair. He carefully removed the old stainless steel thermos. It had been washed, polished. Its scratched surface gleamed faintly beneath the office lights. "I believe this belongs to you." Dorothy accepted it gently. Her fingertips lingered over the engraved initials. At Angela Thompson. "It means a great deal to me." "I know." Samuel's voice softened. "I figured that out sometime around 3 this morning." She looked at him curiously. "You drank the coffee?" "I did. It probably wasn't very good by then." He smiled for the first time. "It was the best coffee I've had in years." She laughed quietly. "My mother would disagree." "I don't think she would." He paused. "Your kindness wasn't in the coffee." Dorothy lowered her eyes. Samuel reached into another pocket. He placed 4 bills on the small conference table, 1 $5 bill, 3 $1 bills, exactly $8. "I owe you this." Dorothy looked at the money but made no move to take it. "You don't owe me." "I do." "No." She smiled gently. "If you'd handed it back at the bus stop, maybe." He frowned. "What changed?" "Your daughter made it to surgery. Because of you? Because you made it there." Samuel slowly pushed the money closer. Dorothy quietly slid it back. "I didn't lend it." He looked genuinely confused. "I gave it." Silence filled the room. Samuel stared at the $8 for several moments before carefully folding them again. "I've interviewed more than 12,000 job applicants in my career." Dorothy looked surprised. 12,000? Closer to 13? And I've heard every answer people thought I wanted to hear. He smiled sadly. But I've learned something. What? Character almost never introduces itself. Dorothy remained silent. It reveals itself when nobody believes anyone is watching. Before she could respond, the conference room door opened. A woman in her late 40s entered, carrying a slim folder. She wore no expensive jewelry beyond a simple wedding band and a silver watch. Her posture radiated quiet authority. Samuel stood. Dorothy, I'd like you to meet Rebecca Collins. Rebecca extended her hand. It's good to finally meet you. Dorothy shook it cautiously. Mr. Walker has told me a little about last night. Dorothy quickly interrupted. I hope he didn't exaggerate. Rebecca smiled. He actually left out most of it. Dorothy looked from one to the other. I don't really understand why I'm here. Rebecca pulled out a chair. That's fair. She sat down. So let me begin with something important. Dorothy listened carefully. We didn't invite you here to offer charity. A strange mixture of relief and disappointment passed across Dorothy's face. Rebecca noticed. We're also not offering you a job. Dorothy nodded slowly. I didn't expect one. Samuel quietly watched both women without speaking. Rebecca leaned forward. What we're offering. She gently slid a thin folder across the table. So, is an opportunity to earn one. Dorothy looked down at the folder without opening it. Across the cover in bold letters were the words, Horizon Leadership Development Program. Her heart began beating faster. She had no idea that accepting the folder would become the hardest and most important decision of her life. Dorothy Thompson rested both hands on the folder without opening it. The words on the cover seemed too important to belong in front of someone like her. Horizon Leadership Development Program. Leadership. She almost smiled at the irony. For the past 11 years, she had led exactly one team. Herself. And on the hardest days, even that felt uncertain. Rebecca Collins waited patiently. She had spent decades interviewing applicants, and she had learned something that numbers never revealed. People's first reaction to an opportunity often exposed more than any resume. Some leaned forward immediately, some negotiated before listening, some assumed they deserved it. Dorothy did none of those things. Instead, she asked quietly, Why me? Rebecca glanced briefly toward Samuel. He nodded almost imperceptibly. You've probably imagined several answers already. I have. And what are they? Dorothy hesitated. I thought maybe you felt sorry for me. Rebecca answered without hesitation. I don't hire people because I feel sorry for them. The words were firm, not cruel, simply honest. Dorothy appreciated that. Then maybe because I helped Mr. Walker. Rebecca folded her hands. If all we wanted to do was repay a favor, we'd write you a check. She let the sentence settle. We're not interested in repaying $8. Dorothy looked confused. What are you interested in? Judgment? She frowned slightly. Rebecca continued. Our company moves millions of dollars worth of freight every week. She pointed toward the warehouse visible through the conference room window. Every day, our supervisors make hundreds of decisions. About shipping, about people. Rebecca leaned back. You can't teach honesty. She paused. You can't teach compassion. Another pause. You can't teach someone to do the right thing when nobody is watching. Dorothy remained silent. You can train software. You can train warehouse systems. You can train inventory management. But character, Rebecca shook her head. Character is built long before someone walks through our doors. Samuel spoke for the first time. Last night you had every reason to keep those $8. Dorothy looked down. My son needed that money. I know. You knew that. I noticed the overdue utility notice sticking out of your purse when the wind caught it. Dorothy instinctively touched her handbag. Embarrassment warmed her cheeks. I wasn't trying to look. I know. Samuel's voice carried genuine kindness, but I saw enough. He looked directly into her eyes. You believed my daughter mattered as much as your own hardship, Dorothy answered softly. I believed someone had to. The room became quiet. Rebecca slowly smiled. That's exactly why you're here. Dorothy finally opened the folder. Inside were several neatly organized documents. An application, a training schedule, course descriptions, attendance requirements, performance evaluations. At the very top was a single sentence printed in bold. This program guarantees opportunity, not employment. Dorothy appreciated those words more than promises. Promises were easy. Opportunity demanded work, Rebecca explained. The program lasts 8 weeks. Dorothy immediately noticed the coincidence. 8 weeks, $8. She said nothing. Rebecca continued. You'll study warehouse operations, logistics, planning inventory systems, conflict resolution, safety management, and team leadership. Dorothy nodded slowly. I've never worked in logistics. You've organized your life on almost nothing for years. Rebecca smiled faintly. You'd be surprised how transferable those skills are. Samuel chuckled. I've seen executives who couldn't manage a household budget half as well. Dorothy laughed softly. I doubt that. I don't. Rebecca reached another page. There is a training stipend. Dorothy looked up. How much? $400 a week. Her breath caught. $400. It wasn't wealth, but it meant groceries, gas, school supplies, electricity, hope. Then Rebecca added, classes begin at 8 every morning. Dorothy's expression changed immediately. My shift ends at midnight. We know. I wouldn't sleep. You'd sleep very little. She silently calculated the hours. Finish work near midnight, travel home, sleep perhaps 3 hours, attend class, pick up Ethan after school, homework, dinner, return to work. Repeat. 8 weeks. It sounded almost impossible. Rebecca seemed to read every thought crossing Dorothy's face. I won't pretend it'll be easy. I'm not afraid of difficult. I didn't think you were, Samuel smiled. That is another reason you're here. Dorothy looked back at the papers. What happens if I fail? Rebecca answered immediately. Then you fail. No sugarcoating, no comforting speeches. And if I pass, you still might not get hired? Dorothy raised an eyebrow. So there's no guarantee. No, Rebecca's voice remained steady. We're offering a chance. Not a rescue. Dorothy respected that more than she expected. After a long silence, she asked, when do I need to decide? Rebecca checked her watch. The entrance assessment starts in 45 minutes. Dorothy blinked. Today? We prefer potential applicants to make decisions before fear has too much time to speak. Samuel laughed quietly. Rebecca has always believed courage expires if left sitting too long. Dorothy smiled. My mother would have liked her. Rebecca returned the smile. I would have liked your mother. For a brief moment, Angela felt strangely present inside the room. Dorothy imagined what her mother would have said. Don't ask whether you're ready. Ask whether you're willing. She took a slow breath. I'll take the assessment. Rebecca nodded once. Good. She pressed a button on the conference phone. A young coordinator entered carrying a tablet. This is Melissa Grant. Melissa smiled warmly. I'll show you to the testing room. Dorothy followed her through several hallways. Employees hurried between offices carrying clipboards and tablets. Forklifts moved carefully through distant warehouse aisles. Nobody seemed rushed. Everyone simply knew where they belonged. Dorothy wondered what that felt like. Melissa stopped outside a quiet classroom. Only 5 other applicants sat inside. Most looked younger. One wore a business suit. Another carried a laptop covered with university stickers. Dorothy suddenly became very aware of her department store shoes. Melissa handed her a pencil. "Good luck." Dorothy chose a seat near the back. A man across the room glanced toward her. He looked to be in his mid-30s, athletic build, expensive watch, confident smile. He leaned over. "First time." She nodded. "I'm Marcus Reed." "Dorothy Thompson." "What department are you transferring from?" "I'm not." He looked puzzled. "You already work here?" "No." "So you're an outside applicant?" "Yes." "What experience do you have?" She answered honestly. "I'm a janitor." Marcus blinked. "Oh." He looked away politely. The conversation ended. Dorothy understood the meaning behind that single word. Oh. She had heard it before. It usually meant expectations had just changed. A gray-haired instructor entered precisely at 10. "My name is Harold Simmons." He distributed thick testing booklets. "This exam measures how you solve problems." He looked around the room. "There are no trick questions." He smiled. "There are, however, honest ones." Dorothy opened the booklet. The first section wasn't mathematics. It wasn't vocabulary. It wasn't technical knowledge. Instead, it described workplace situations. An employee discovers missing inventory. 2 coworkers argue. A shipment arrives damaged. A supervisor makes an obvious mistake. What should happen? Dorothy frowned. These weren't school questions. They were life questions. She began writing. Not what sounded impressive, what she genuinely believed. Time passed quickly. When Harold announced the final 5 minutes, Dorothy reached the last page. One question stopped her. Describe a moment when you chose what was right, even though it cost you something important. She stared at the blank space. Slowly, she wrote about a cold bus stop. $8, an old thermos, a stranger. She never mentioned Samuel's name. She never mentioned Horizon. She simply ended with one sentence. Sometimes the price of kindness is immediate, but its value isn't. She closed the booklet. Across the room, Marcus finished moments later. As applicants began leaving, Harold quietly gathered Dorothy's test separately from the others. He didn't say why. She wasn't sure whether to worry. Outside the classroom, Melissa caught up with her. "Miss Thompson?" "Yes." "Miss Collins asked if you'd wait before going home." Dorothy's heartbeat quickened again. "Did I forget something?" Melissa smiled mysteriously. "No." She glanced toward the conference wing. "I think someone just finished reading your last answer." Dorothy Thompson sat alone in the small waiting area outside Rebecca Collins's office. The chair beneath her was comfortable. Too comfortable. It made her feel as though she didn't belong there. She folded her hands in her lap and watched employees pass through the hallway with quiet purpose. No one seemed rushed. Forklift schedules inventory, reports, shipment updates, maintenance requests. Everything moved with calm efficiency. She wondered what it would be like to wake each morning knowing exactly where your future was headed. For most of her adult life, the future had been measured one utility bill at a time, one grocery receipt, one tank of gas, one unexpected expense away from disaster. The receptionist smiled as she walked past. "Can I get you some coffee while you wait?" Dorothy instinctively reached toward the empty space beside her purse. Her thermos. Then she remembered it was still sitting inside Samuel's office after he had insisted on cleaning it once more before returning it. She smiled politely. "Water is fine." A paper cup appeared moments later. She thanked the receptionist. Even something as simple as being offered a drink felt unfamiliar. Usually she was the one offering help, or cleaning up after everyone else had left. Not long afterward, Rebecca stepped out of her office carrying Dorothy's test booklet. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't frowning either. "Would you come in?" Dorothy stood immediately. The office overlooked the warehouse floor through a wall of tall windows. Workers in reflective safety vests moved pallets with practiced precision, while supervisors checked tablets and radios. Rebecca closed the door behind them. She laid the test on her desk. "I've read your answers." Dorothy nodded nervously. "Were they wrong?" Rebecca looked genuinely surprised. "There were no correct answers." I know what you mean." She opened the booklet to the final page. "This answer." She tapped the paragraph about the bus stop. "You never mentioned that the stranger turned out to be Samuel." "I didn't think that mattered." "Why not?" "Because I didn't know who he was when I helped him." Rebecca studied her quietly. Most applicants would have written that part first. Dorothy shrugged. It wasn't the important part. What was that someone needed help? Rebecca slowly closed the booklet. "I've spent 23 years interviewing people." She leaned back in her chair. "Do you know the most common mistake?" Dorothy shook her head. "They try to impress me." A faint smile crossed Dorothy's face. "I've never been very good at that." "No." Rebecca smiled back. "I don't think you have." For a moment, they simply looked out across the warehouse. Then Rebecca spoke again. "You passed." Dorothy blinked. "I did." "You scored among the highest we've had this year." She stared in disbelief. "There must be some mistake." "There isn't. I've never even worked in logistics." Rebecca laughed softly. "You think logistics is mostly about trucks?" "It isn't. It's mostly about people making hundreds of small decisions correctly." She paused. "You've been doing that every day for years." Dorothy looked confused. Rebecca continued. "When you're responsible for every dollar, every meal, every hour, every school form, every bus schedule," she smiled gently, "you're already managing a complicated system." Dorothy had never thought about it that way. Rebecca slid another document across the desk. "Training begins Monday." She picked it up carefully. The schedule looked intimidating. Monday through Friday, 8:00 a.m. until 2:30 p.m. Homework every evening. Practical evaluations every Friday. Attendance mandatory. Dorothy silently calculated the hours again. She would leave work after midnight, sleep perhaps 3 hours, study, care for Ethan, return to work. 8 weeks. Her excitement slowly gave way to concern. Rebecca noticed immediately. "What's wrong?" "I don't know if I can do both." "Work and training?" Dorothy nodded. "I can't quit my night job." "I wouldn't expect you to." "I can't leave my son alone." "I wouldn't expect that either." "I can't afford daycare after school." Rebecca remained thoughtful for a moment. Then she opened a drawer and removed another folder. "Horizon has a partnership with a neighborhood learning center." Dorothy looked up. "They supervise employees' children after school." She blinked. "I didn't know that." "Most people don't." Rebecca handed her a brochure. "The cost is based on income." Dorothy scanned the numbers. Even with the reduced rate, it would still stretch her budget. Rebecca noticed the hesitation. "The training stipend starts next Friday." Dorothy looked relieved. "It might be enough." "It should be." Samuel knocked gently before entering. "Am I interrupting?" "Not at all," Rebecca replied. He walked over carrying the polished thermos. "I believe this belongs with its owner." Dorothy accepted it with both hands. The steel felt pleasantly warm. Samuel smiled. "I replaced the rubber seal." She looked surprised. You didn't have to. I wanted to. He hesitated before adding, It shouldn't leak anymore. She ran her thumb across the familiar scratches. Somehow it felt exactly the same, yet different, like the night before had quietly become part of its history. Samuel looked toward Rebecca. Did you tell her? I did. And Rebecca smiled. She passed. Samuel's face brightened with unmistakable pride. I knew you would. Dorothy laughed. You couldn't have known that. No, he chuckled. But I knew you'd answer honestly. Rebecca glanced at her watch. I have another meeting. She stood. Take the weekend. To rest. To prepare. Dorothy nodded. I'll be here Monday. We expect you at 7:45. I won't be late. I don't think you know how. They all laughed. As Dorothy stepped into the hallway, Samuel caught up with her. Would you mind walking with me? Of course. They rode the elevator together. Neither spoke until they reached the parking lot. Samuel stopped beside an older blue pickup truck. I've been thinking about last night. So have I. I almost didn't ask you. Dorothy looked puzzled. For the money. Why? You looked tired. I was. You looked worried. I was. I almost kept walking. Dorothy leaned lightly against the truck. What changed your mind? Samuel smiled sadly. My daughter once told me something. What was it? When people stop asking for help. He paused. They usually need it the most. Dorothy quietly absorbed the words. I've remembered that ever since. He looked at her carefully. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. Why did you really help me? She smiled. I've asked myself that a few times today. And I don't think kindness starts with certainty. Samuel listened closely. I think it starts with deciding who you refuse to become. He lowered his eyes. That's a beautiful answer. It's an honest one. He reached into his pocket. Dorothy instinctively raised an eyebrow. I already told you, he laughed. It's not money. Instead, he handed her a small folded card. On the front was only a phone number. My personal number. She accepted it. If your car refuses to start again, he smiled warmly. Call me before you start walking. Dorothy laughed. I'll try. No. He shook his head. I'm serious. She slipped the card into her purse. Thank you. As she turned towards the bus stop, Samuel called after her. One more thing. She looked back. My daughter wants to meet you. Dorothy looked surprised. She doesn't even know me. She knows enough. When she's strong enough. Dorothy nodded gently. I'd like that. The ride home felt different from every bus ride before. Nothing around her had changed. The cracked sidewalks remained cracked. The aging apartment buildings remained worn. Bills still waited at home. Her night shift still began in only a few hours. Yet something inside her had quietly shifted. For the first time in many years, she wasn't walking toward another day that looked exactly like yesterday. She was walking toward Monday, toward uncertainty, toward exhaustion, toward a chance she hadn't asked for. When she reached her apartment building, Ethan was already sitting on the front steps with a library book balanced on his knees. The moment he saw her, he jumped up. Mom, she smiled. What are you doing out here? I wanted to see your face. My face? So I'd know. Know what? He searched her expression carefully. Then he grinned. It was something. Dorothy laughed so hard that tears filled her eyes. She wrapped him in a tight embrace. Yes, she whispered. It was something. She didn't yet realize that the hardest part of the journey wasn't getting the opportunity. It would be finding the strength to keep it when every part of her life demanded more than she thought she had to give. Monday arrived faster than Dorothy Thompson expected. She slept for barely 3 hours on Sunday afternoon. No matter how hard she tried, her mind refused to rest. Every time she closed her eyes, she imagined herself walking into a classroom filled with people who belonged there. People with college degrees. People who understood spreadsheets, inventory systems, and management software. People who had never spent an entire evening deciding whether milk or electricity mattered more. At 6:05 Monday morning, her alarm vibrated across the nightstand. She had only been asleep since a little after 2. For a moment she stared at the ceiling. Every muscle protested. Her shoulders burned from pushing cleaning carts. Her knees ached. Her feet still carried the soreness from walking home after her car had failed. She wanted 5 more minutes. Instead, she sat up immediately. Angela Thompson had repeated one sentence so often that Dorothy could still hear it as clearly as if her mother were standing beside the bed. If discipline waits for comfort, it never begins. Dorothy swung her feet onto the floor. The apartment was quiet. She showered quickly, dressed in the only business-casual clothes she owned, and packed a notebook, 2 pencils, and the old stainless steel thermos. The thermos had become more than a keepsake now. Whenever she touched its scratched metal surface, she remembered the night everything had changed. In the kitchen, she quietly prepared breakfast. Scrambled eggs, toast, orange slices, nothing fancy. Just enough to begin the day without hunger. At exactly 6:40, Ethan shuffled into the kitchen, rubbing his eyes. "You already look awake." "I've had practice." He smiled sleepily. "Nervous?" "A little." "A lot," Dorothy laughed. "Maybe." He climbed onto the chair opposite her. "You'll do fine." "What makes you so sure?" "Because you study harder than anybody I know." She looked at him fondly. "That doesn't always mean you'll succeed." "No," he shrugged, "but it means you'll keep trying." Children rarely realized how profound they sounded. Dorothy reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "Thank you." After breakfast, they walked together to the neighborhood learning center that partnered with Horizon Freight. The building had once been an elementary school. Bright murals covered the walls. Children laughed on the playground despite the early hour. Inside, a cheerful coordinator named Mrs. Linda Foster greeted them. "You must be Ethan." "Yes, ma'am." "And you're Dorothy." Dorothy nodded. "I appreciate you meeting with us." Linda smiled warmly. "We're happy to have him." She knelt beside Ethan. "We've got homework help, basketball after school, and a science club." Ethan's eyes widened. "Really? Really?" He looked back at his mother. "I think I'll survive." Dorothy laughed. "I was worried." "I know." He hugged her quickly before following Linda toward the activity room. Halfway down the hallway, he turned around. "You forgot something." Dorothy frowned. "What?" "The second cup." She blinked, then smiled. Without another word, she unscrewed the thermos and poured coffee into 2 paper cups. She kept one. She left the other on the reception counter. Linda looked puzzled. "For whoever needs it today." Linda smiled gently. "I think someone always does." Dorothy walked out feeling unexpectedly lighter. She reached Horizon Freight 15 minutes early. Rebecca Collins was already waiting in the training room. "So punctual." Dorothy smiled. "I didn't want to start late." Rebecca looked toward the clock. "You actually started early." The classroom slowly filled. Marcus Reed entered carrying a tablet and an expensive laptop bag. He noticed Dorothy immediately. "Morning?" "Good morning." He hesitated. "I didn't realize you'd accepted." "I almost didn't." He nodded politely. "I'm glad you did." His tone sounded sincere, but something about his expression remained difficult to read. By 8 o'clock, 12 trainees occupied the room. Harold Simmons stood at the front. "Welcome." He waited until every conversation ended. This program isn't about finding the smartest person. He looked around carefully. It's about discovering who becomes dependable when pressure arrives. He wrote 3 words across the whiteboard: accuracy, responsibility, trust. Everything we teach begins here. The morning passed quickly. Inventory systems, warehouse maps, shipping procedures, barcode scanners, safety protocols. Most trainees typed rapidly into laptops. Dorothy wrote everything by hand. She had never owned a computer. Marcus noticed. "You don't use one." "I've used library computers." "That's it." She nodded. "You'll probably want to practice." "I know." He didn't reply. By lunchtime, Dorothy's notebook had already filled nearly 20 pages. Every sentence was carefully organized, every heading underlined, every important point highlighted with a borrowed yellow marker. Rebecca quietly walked past the tables while everyone ate. She glanced into Dorothy's notebook. The pages looked remarkably clear. Not because they contained the most information, because they showed connections, questions, arrows, small observations in the margins. Rebecca smiled to herself. Learning wasn't only about collecting facts, it was about making them meaningful. That afternoon, the trainees completed their first warehouse simulation. Teams of 3 received shipment orders and had to organize inventory efficiently. Dorothy's team included Marcus and another trainee named Olivia Chen. Marcus naturally stepped into the leadership role. "I'll assign jobs." Neither woman objected. For the first 20 minutes, everything moved smoothly. Then Olivia frowned. "Something's wrong." Marcus barely looked up. "What?" "The quantities don't match." "They do." "No." She pointed toward the order sheet. Marcus waved dismissively. "The scanner will catch it." Dorothy quietly reviewed both documents. Olivia was right. One pallet contained 12 boxes. The paperwork listed 21. The numbers had been reversed. If shipped that way, the customer would receive the wrong inventory. Dorothy spoke softly. "I think Olivia found the mistake." Marcus sighed. "We're already behind." "It'll take 30 seconds." "We don't have 30 seconds." Dorothy hesitated. Then she walked directly to the instructor. "Mr. Simmons," he approached. "Yes. I think our paperwork contains a transposed quantity." Harold reviewed the documents. After only a few seconds, he nodded. "Correct." He looked toward the entire class. "Everyone stop." The room fell silent. He held up the paperwork. "This error was intentional." Several trainees exchanged confused looks. "We wanted to see who would prioritize speed over accuracy." His eyes settled briefly on Marcus, then moved toward Dorothy. "Good catch." Marcus forced a smile. "Nice observation." But the disappointment on his face lingered. After class ended, trainees slowly packed their bags. Marcus caught up with Dorothy in the hallway. "You embarrassed me." She looked genuinely surprised. "I wasn't trying to." "You could have mentioned it again before calling Harold." "I did." "You should have pushed harder." Dorothy answered calmly. "I thought protecting the shipment mattered more than protecting our pride." Marcus stared at her. For a long moment, neither spoke. Finally, he shrugged. "I guess." But his voice carried little conviction. Rebecca had witnessed the entire exchange from the observation room above the warehouse floor. She made a brief note in her evaluation folder. "Does not seek attention. Intervenes only when necessary. Prioritizes outcome over recognition." 30 minutes later, Dorothy hurried to pick up Ethan. She arrived almost breathless. "I'm sorry I'm late." Linda smiled. "You aren't." Dorothy checked the clock. She had somehow arrived 5 minutes early. Inside the activity room, Ethan sat helping another boy with multiplication problems. The smaller child looked frustrated. Ethan patiently explained each step. Not once did he raise his voice. Dorothy watched quietly from the doorway. The scene reminded her painfully of Angela helping neighborhood children with homework long after exhausting workdays. Kindness had never been something Angela taught through lectures. She had taught it by repetition, by example, by ordinary moments. On the walk home, Ethan looked up at her. "How was school?" She laughed. "I was going to ask you that." "You first." She smiled. "I learned a lot." "Were people nice?" "Most were." "Not everybody." Dorothy hesitated. "Some people need a little more time." Ethan nodded thoughtfully. "Like when I got scared on my first day." "Exactly." He kicked a pebble along the sidewalk. "I think if you're kind to them anyway." He looked up. "They'll probably catch up." Dorothy smiled. "I hope you're right." As evening settled over Phoenix, she prepared dinner, helped Ethan finish homework, changed into her janitor's uniform, and returned to the airport for another overnight shift. Her body already felt exhausted. The week had barely begun. She had no idea that the greatest challenge ahead would not be the lack of sleep or the endless studying. It would be earning the respect of someone who had already decided she didn't deserve to be there. By the middle of the second week, Dorothy Thompson had stopped counting how many hours she slept. Instead, she counted routines. Wake up, study, pick up Ethan, cook dinner, leave for the airport, work until midnight, review class notes during her meal break, sleep, repeat. It wasn't healthy. She knew that. But there are seasons in life when balance becomes a luxury, and survival asks only for persistence. Every morning before leaving the apartment, she still filled Angela's old thermos. 2 cups, always 2. The receptionist at the learning center had started smiling whenever Dorothy arrived. "You brought the second cup again?" Dorothy nodded. "Someone usually needs it." Some mornings, the second cup went to a crossing guard standing outside before sunrise. Other mornings, it was for a school custodian finishing the overnight shift. Once it went to a grandmother sitting alone outside the clinic waiting for the doors to open. Dorothy never asked questions. She simply handed over the warm cup with a smile. It became a quiet habit. No announcements, no photographs, no social media posts. Just warmth passed from one pair of hands to another. Inside Horizon Freight, however, the atmosphere had begun to change. The trainees were no longer strangers. Friendships formed. Small groups naturally appeared during breaks. Marcus Reed had become the unofficial leader of several classmates. He was intelligent, quick with technology, confident in discussions. But Dorothy noticed something else. Marcus hated making mistakes in front of other people. Whenever a project went well, he spoke using the word I. Whenever something failed, he quickly switched to we. It wasn't cruelty. It was insecurity wearing confidence like a costume. Dorothy recognized it because she had seen something similar years ago in Ethan after his father left. Children often pretended they weren't hurting. Adults simply became better actors. On Wednesday afternoon, Harold Simmons divided the class into pairs for a warehouse optimization exercise. Dorothy glanced around the room. Harold smiled. "This week's partners have already been assigned." He read from a clipboard. "Marcus Reed." Marcus looked up. "Dorothy Thompson." A faint groan escaped Marcus before he could stop himself. Several trainees noticed. Dorothy pretended not to. They carried their materials into a mock warehouse filled with shelves, scanners, and shipping labels. Harold explained the assignment. "You have 90 minutes. Your goal isn't speed." He looked directly at Marcus. "It's judgment." The exercise simulated a large customer order arriving unexpectedly, while another shipment had already fallen behind schedule. Limited workers, limited equipment, too many priorities. Dorothy studied the paperwork quietly. Marcus immediately opened the scheduling software. "We'll move Team B." Dorothy shook her head. "They're unloading refrigerated medicine." "So, if we delay them, the medication waits longer." "We'll make up the time." She pointed toward another section. What about delaying furniture instead? Marcus frowned. The customer will complain. The hospital will too. He stopped typing. For several seconds, he reread both orders. Dorothy was right. One shipment contained replacement office chairs. The other contained temperature-sensitive insulin. Marcus slowly removed his hands from the keyboard. I didn't even notice. You were looking at deadlines. And I was looking at consequences. Neither spoke for a while. Eventually, Marcus smiled. Let's move the furniture. Harold, who had been observing quietly from the far corner, made another note on his clipboard. Not technical, ethical reasoning. As the exercise continued, Marcus began asking Dorothy's opinion before making decisions. The change was subtle, but real. After class ended, he caught up with her in the hallway. I owe you an apology. Dorothy looked surprised. For what? For last week. She smiled gently. You don't owe me anything. I judged you. You didn't know me. I assumed you were here because of Mr. Walker. Dorothy laughed softly. I wondered that myself. Marcus shook his head. I've been competing with everyone. He hesitated. My father always said second place meant you weren't trying. Dorothy looked at him carefully. That sounds exhausting. He laughed. It is. She thought for a moment. My mother used to say something different. What? The strongest people don't race everyone. They make sure everyone reaches home. Marcus looked down. I think I'd like your mother. So would I. Before he could answer, Rebecca appeared from another hallway. Dorothy. Yes. Would you come with me for a moment? Marcus nodded politely and continued toward the parking lot. Rebecca led Dorothy to a quiet conference room overlooking the warehouse. Samuel Walker was already there. He stood when Dorothy entered. You look tired. She smiled. I've looked tired for years. Samuel laughed. Fair point. Rebecca poured 3 cups of coffee. Dorothy noticed that one came from her own thermos. You remembered. Samuel smiled. I asked if I could borrow it for a minute. She wrapped both hands around the warm cup. For a few moments, nobody spoke. Finally, Samuel broke the silence. Emily wanted me to thank you again. How is she? Walking. Dorothy's face brightened. Already. Slowly. He reached into his wallet and removed a photograph. A young woman with curly, dark hair smiled from a hospital garden, holding a small bouquet of yellow flowers. She insisted I show you this. Dorothy studied the picture. She smiled without realizing it. She has kind eyes. She gets that from her mother. Samuel carefully returned the photo to his wallet. Then his expression grew more thoughtful. Can I tell you something I've never shared with anyone in this building? Dorothy nodded. Of course. Rebecca remained silent. She had heard pieces of the story before. Not all of it. Samuel looked out the window before speaking. 32 years ago, I interviewed a woman for an entry-level warehouse position. Dorothy listened quietly. She wasn't the most qualified. He smiled faintly. But she arrived 30 minutes early. He looked down at his hands. Halfway through the interview, she apologized. What for? She thought I heard her stomach growling. Dorothy's heart tightened. Samuel continued. She had skipped dinner so her little girl could eat. He swallowed. I hired her. What happened? She became one of the finest supervisors we've ever had. Rebecca nodded. I've heard people mention her. Samuel smiled sadly. She retired after 27 years. Dorothy noticed the sadness in his voice. What was her name? Angela Thompson. Dorothy froze. The room became completely still. For a moment she wondered if she had imagined hearing it. Her voice barely emerged. My mother, Samuel nodded slowly. I didn't recognize your last name at the bus stop. He looked genuinely emotional. It wasn't until I saw the initials on your thermos. At Angela Thompson? Dorothy stared at him. You knew my mother. I gave her her first opportunity. Tears filled Dorothy's eyes before she realized they were coming. Samuel's own eyes glistened. Your mother never told you. Dorothy slowly shook her head. She always said someone believed in her. Samuel smiled. I suppose she remembered the opportunity. He paused. More than the man. Rebecca quietly looked between them. Neither of them had expected this. Samuel leaned forward. I need you to understand something. Dorothy listened through tears. I didn't invite you here because you were Angela's daughter. He spoke carefully. I didn't even know you were. She nodded silently. I invited you because for one impossible moment on a cold night, you made exactly the same decision your mother made 32 years ago. Dorothy closed her eyes. Samuel continued. When Angela started here, she brought an old coffee pot to work every Friday. Dorothy smiled through her tears. 2 cups. Samuel smiled back. Always 2. The room fell silent again. Dorothy suddenly understood. The tradition she had believed belonged only to her family had quietly touched another life decades earlier. Her mother's kindness had not disappeared when she died. It had simply been waiting for someone else to carry it forward. Samuel looked at the old thermos resting between them. I thought I was remembering your kindness that night. He gently touched the scratched metal surface. But I think... His voice softened. I was meeting an old friend again. Dorothy could no longer hold back her tears. Not because opportunity had finally found her, but because for the first time since Angela's death, she realized that her mother's goodness had continued living in people she had never even met. And now, somehow, it was living in her too. Dorothy Thompson barely slept that night. Not because of the workload, not because she had another early class. It was because she couldn't stop thinking about her mother. Angela Thompson had never mentioned Samuel Walker's name, not once. She had never talked about the interview that changed her life, never spoken about the warehouse, never described the opportunity that had allowed her to raise Dorothy with dignity after being widowed. Instead, Angela had always spoken about choices. People remember kindness longer than success. You don't own generosity, you borrow it. And above all, leave every place a little better than you found it. As Dorothy wiped down airport windows shortly after midnight, she found herself smiling. Passengers hurried past her without a second glance. Nothing around her had changed. She was still wearing blue gloves, still emptying trash bins, still polishing fingerprints from glass doors. But inside, something had shifted. She no longer saw herself as a woman who had been overlooked. She saw herself as part of a story that had begun long before she was born. Near Gate C, 18, Rosa Martinez noticed the smile. You won the lottery or something? Dorothy laughed. No. You got promoted? Not yet. So why are you smiling? Dorothy looked through the giant windows at an airplane slowly taxiing toward the runway. I found out my mother left footprints I never knew existed. Rosa tilted her head. That sounds like something only you would say. Maybe. What does it mean? Dorothy simply smiled. It means she kept planting seeds without telling anyone. Rosa nodded slowly. I like that. The shift passed more quickly than usual. At 7:35 the following morning, Dorothy arrived at Horizon Freight carrying her notebook, her thermos, and a determination that felt stronger than fatigue. The day's lesson was unlike the previous ones. Instead of sitting in the classroom, the trainees gathered inside the warehouse operations center. Rows of computer monitors displayed shipment routes across the country. Forklifts moved between towering shelves. Dispatch radios crackled every few seconds. Harold Simmons stood in front of a large digital screen. "Today," he announced, "you're no longer students." The trainees exchanged curious looks. "For the next 6 hours, you're acting supervisors." Marcus grinned. "Finally." Harold smiled. "Don't celebrate yet." He pointed toward the screen. "You'll each receive unexpected problems throughout the day. Your decisions affect every team." Rebecca Collins stood near the back of the room with a clipboard. She wasn't there to teach. She was there to observe. Each trainee was assigned a workstation. Dorothy found herself responsible for coordinating 3 loading docks in the simulation. The first hour went surprisingly well. She reviewed schedules carefully, double-checked inventory, confirmed driver arrivals. Everything seemed manageable. Then at exactly 9:42 a.m., Harold walked over and quietly placed a red envelope beside her keyboard. Emergency scenario. Dorothy opened it. A truck carrying emergency generators for a rural hospital had broken down. A replacement truck was available, but assigning it would delay deliveries to 2 major retail stores. She immediately began reviewing options. Marcus glanced toward her station. "What'd you get?" "Hospital shipment." "Ouch." He looked over her shoulder. "I'd delay it." "The hospital—" "No." "The retailers." "They'll complain." "They always complain." Marcus shrugged. "The retailers pay millions." Dorothy continued reading. The generators were needed because severe storms had damaged power lines overnight. Without them, parts of the hospital would be operating on limited backup electricity. She imagined patients relying on ventilators, operating rooms, newborn intensive care units. The decision suddenly felt obvious. She reassigned the replacement truck. The computer immediately flashed a warning. Estimated financial penalty $187,000. Marcus whistled. "That's going to hurt." Dorothy calmly entered her explanation. "Patient safety outweighs delivery penalty." She pressed confirm. Minutes later, Harold appeared. "You understand that decision cost the company money?" "Yes." "Would you make the same decision again?" "Yes." "Why?" "Money can be recovered." She looked directly at him. "Lost time in an emergency sometimes can't?" Harold didn't react. He simply wrote something on his clipboard. Across the room, another trainee chose the opposite option. The retailers received their shipment. The hospital remained delayed. The simulation continued. By noon, new problems appeared one after another. A forklift malfunction, a missing shipment, an employee reporting a family emergency, an incorrect inventory count. Pressure increased steadily. Several trainees began making rushed decisions. Marcus grew visibly frustrated. His normally confident voice became sharp. "This system is impossible." Dorothy quietly continued working. One problem at a time, one decision at a time. Angela's voice echoed in her memory. "When life gets loud, slow your heart before your hands." She took one careful breath before solving each new challenge. At 1:15 p.m., the largest crisis arrived. The simulation intentionally sent contradictory information to every workstation. Drivers received different instructions than warehouse staff. Inventory counts no longer matched shipping manifests. Phones rang constantly. Several trainees began arguing. Marcus slammed his notebook onto the desk. "This data is wrong," another trainee shouted back. "You're reading yesterday's report." Voices rose across the operations room. Dorothy looked around. Nobody was listening anymore. Everyone was talking. She stood, not dramatically, simply because she needed to see the room. Then she spoke. "Everyone." Nobody heard. She tried again. "Ladies and gentlemen." Still nothing. She reached for the nearest handheld radio. The brief electronic chirp cut through the noise. Every head turned. Her voice remained calm. Can we stop solving different problems for 1 minute? Silence. She walked to the center whiteboard. Let's write down only the facts we all know. Marcus folded his arms. We're losing time. We already lost it. She picked up a marker. What truck do we know is actually here? Someone answered. She wrote it down. What inventory has been physically confirmed? Another trainee responded. Within 5 minutes, the shouting disappeared. The room began rebuilding the schedule together. Harold exchanged a glance with Rebecca. Neither said a word. The simulation ended 30 minutes later. Everyone looked exhausted. Harold stepped to the front. Good work. A few trainees laughed sarcastically. No, he corrected. I mean it. He displayed the final evaluation screen. Several teams had finished with strong efficiency scores. Others had minimized financial losses. Then he showed another category. Leadership under pressure. Dorothy's name appeared first. She looked genuinely surprised. Marcus leaned back in his chair. I knew it. She turned toward him. You did? He smiled. You never tried to be in charge. He shrugged. You just started helping. Rebecca finally spoke. Leadership isn't the loudest voice in the room. She looked directly at the trainees. It's often the calmest. She walked toward Dorothy. I'd like to ask you one question. Dorothy nodded. When everyone started arguing, Rebecca paused. Why didn't you? Dorothy thought for several seconds, then answered honestly. Because confused people don't need another confused voice. Rebecca smiled. And where did you learn that? Dorothy looked down at the scratched thermos sitting beside her notebook. My mother. Rebecca nodded slowly. I was hoping you'd say that. As the trainees packed their bags, Marcus quietly approached Dorothy. I owe you another apology. She laughed. You're collecting quite a few. I know. He looked embarrassed. I've spent years trying to prove I should lead. He glanced toward the now empty operations floor. You never tried. I wasn't. You weren't. I was trying to solve the problem. Marcus stood silently for a moment. Then he smiled. I've been solving the wrong one. For the first time since the program began, they walked out of the building side by side, not as competitors, but as teammates. Neither of them noticed Rebecca watching from the second-floor window. She wrote one final note in Dorothy's evaluation file before closing it. Technical skills can be taught. Character multiplies the skills of everyone around it. Then she underlined the sentence twice. The 8th Friday arrived with a sunrise Dorothy Thompson had almost forgotten how to notice. For 2 months, mornings had never truly belonged to her. They had been checkpoints, deadlines, class schedules, coffee, homework, work, sleep, repeat. Now standing outside Horizon Freight with Angela's old thermos warming her hands, Dorothy realized she had made it to the final evaluation. She looked up at the company sign. 8 weeks. $8. The number had followed her like a quiet promise. Inside the training center, the atmosphere was different. Nobody joked as loudly. Nobody rushed through conversations. Even Marcus Reed, who usually greeted everyone with effortless confidence, looked unusually nervous. You sleep at all? He asked. About 4 hours. He laughed. You beat me. I wasn't trying. I know. He looked around the room. Funny. What is... When this started, I thought everyone here was competing against me. And now? Now I think we're all competing against yesterday. Dorothy smiled. That's a better race. Harold Simmons entered carrying a stack of folders. The final assessment isn't a written test. Several trainees exchanged relieved glances. Then Harold added, It's much harder. The smiles disappeared. Rebecca Collins stood beside him. For the next 4 hours, each of you will supervise a real warehouse team. A murmur spread across the room. Real employees? Rebecca nodded. They know you're trainees. They've also been instructed not to make this easy. Harold continued. They'll ask difficult questions. They'll disagree. They'll make mistakes. They'll challenge your decisions. He paused. Your job isn't to prove you're the smartest person in the building. It's to earn enough trust that people choose to follow you. Dorothy felt her stomach tighten. That couldn't be memorized from a textbook. One by one, trainees received their assignments. Marcus would supervise Dock 4. Olivia would manage inventory receiving. Dorothy unfolded her paper. Outbound coordination. Dock 2. Supervisor Team 11. Employees. She quietly whispered to herself. One step at a time. The warehouse buzzed with activity. Forklifts beeped. Loading doors rolled open. Drivers checked manifests. Pallets moved steadily across polished concrete floors. Dorothy introduced herself to her assigned crew. Most smiled politely. One older forklift operator simply nodded. His name badge read Carl Jenkins, 23 years with Horizon Freight. His expression suggested he'd seen dozens of trainees come and go. So, Carl crossed his arms. You gonna tell us how everything should be done? Several workers chuckled. Dorothy smiled. No? That answer surprised him. I'm hoping you'll tell me. Carl raised one eyebrow. What? You've worked here 23 years. I've worked here 8 weeks. She extended her hand. I'd rather learn something before pretending to know everything. Carl stared at her for a long second. Then slowly he shook her hand. Fair enough. The morning began smoothly. Dorothy reviewed shipments, confirmed paperwork, walked the loading lanes instead of staying behind the computer. She asked questions, listened carefully, wrote notes. The employees gradually relaxed around her. Around 10:20 a.m., an unexpected problem developed. A trailer scheduled for Chicago arrived nearly 40 minutes late. Another truck bound for Denver was already waiting at the dock. Only one loading bay remained available. Dispatch called over the radio. Dock 2 advise. Everyone looked toward Dorothy. Carl quietly waited. Several workers immediately suggested moving the Chicago shipment to the back of the schedule. It was late. They can wait. Dorothy reviewed the paperwork. Then she noticed a small blue sticker. Medical priority. Inside the trailer were refrigerated supplies destined for children's hospitals across 3 states. She looked toward Carl. What happens if these stay here another hour? Carl answered honestly. The refrigeration unit keeps running. But if it fails... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Dorothy made her decision. We switch the docks. One employee frowned. But Denver was first. I know. The Denver customer will complain. Probably. She nodded. But children in hospitals shouldn't have to. Carl watched her carefully. He keyed his radio. You heard the supervisor. Switching assignments. No one argued. Not because everyone agreed. Because she had explained why. Leadership, Dorothy realized, wasn't convincing everyone you were right. Sometimes it was helping them understand what mattered most. The rest of the shift moved quickly. Near lunchtime, another challenge appeared. A young warehouse associate accidentally scanned an outgoing pallet twice, creating duplicate inventory records. The mistake stopped 3 shipments. The employee's face turned pale. I'm so sorry. It's my first month. Another trainee supervising nearby immediately began criticizing one of his workers loudly enough for everyone to hear. Dorothy noticed several employees glance nervously toward the embarrassed young associate. She walked over. What's your name? Tyler. Show me exactly what happened. He demonstrated every step. Within 2 minutes, Dorothy found the duplicate scan. She corrected the record. Problem solved. Tyler lowered his head. I really messed up. Dorothy smiled gently. You made one mistake. I slowed everybody down. You also reported it immediately. He looked confused. I was supposed to. Exactly. She placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. I'd rather fix an honest mistake than discover one someone tried to hide. Carl, watching from several yards away, quietly smiled to himself. By early afternoon, the evaluations ended. Rebecca and Harold met privately, while trainees waited in the conference room. Nobody spoke much. The silence carried equal parts hope and fear. Marcus leaned towards Dorothy. If we don't get hired, she looked at him, I'm still glad I came. He nodded slowly. So am I. Almost 30 minutes later, Rebecca entered, carrying a sealed envelope. Behind her came Harold, then Samuel Walker. Dorothy hadn't expected to see him. Samuel smiled warmly, but said nothing. Rebecca stood before the group. Every one of you worked hard. She looked around the room. You should be proud. She paused. Unfortunately, the room became very still. We only have 3 management trainee positions available. A heavy silence settled. Rebecca began reading names. Olivia Chen. Olivia covered her mouth in disbelief. Applause filled the room. Marcus Reed. Marcus exhaled so sharply several people laughed. He looked toward Dorothy with grateful eyes. Rebecca opened the final page. Dorothy Thompson. For one long moment, Dorothy didn't move. She genuinely thought she had misheard. Marcus lightly nudged her arm. That's you. She slowly stood. The room applauded again. Rebecca walked toward her carrying a navy blue employee badge. Unlike the temporary visitor badge Dorothy had worn for weeks, this one carried the Horizon Freight logo beneath her name. Rebecca handed it over. This isn't a gift. Dorothy nodded. I know. You earned it. For a second, Dorothy couldn't speak. She simply held the badge in both hands. It weighed almost nothing, yet somehow it felt heavier than anything she'd ever carried. Samuel stepped forward. I've waited a long time to do this. He reached into his jacket pocket. Not for money, not for paperwork, for a small brass key attached to a faded leather tag. Dorothy looked puzzled. Samuel smiled. Your mother had one just like it. He placed the key in Dorothy's palm. It opens your supervisor locker. Tears filled her eyes immediately. She closed her fingers around the key, not because it unlocked a locker, because it unlocked a memory she never knew existed. After the meeting ended, Dorothy walked outside into the warm Arizona afternoon. She called Ethan before she even reached the parking lot. He answered on the second ring. Hi, Mom. She laughed through happy tears. What are you doing? Science club. I have something to tell you. You got it. She blinked. How did you know? You got your smiling voice. Dorothy laughed even harder. Yes. I got it. A loud cheer erupted through the phone. She could hear children clapping around him. Mrs. Linda Foster laughing, someone shouting, Way to go! For a brief moment, it felt as though the whole world was celebrating with them. But when Dorothy reached home that evening, she found an envelope tucked beneath her apartment door. It bore the logo of the electric company. She froze. Her heart began to pound. She had paid nothing. Not yet. Slowly, she picked up the envelope, uncertain whether this was one final reminder of everything she had survived or the first test of the life she had just begun. Dorothy Thompson stood in the hallway for several seconds, staring at the envelope in her hand. The logo of the electric company seemed larger than it really was. For years, envelopes like this had almost always carried bad news, late fees, past due notices, disconnection warnings. Her fingers hesitated before breaking the seal. Inside was a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't another warning. It was a confirmation. Payment received. Account current. Balance $0. Dorothy frowned. She read it again, then a third time. Someone had paid the remaining balance. There was no explanation, no name, only a transaction number and the date. Yesterday afternoon. The same afternoon she had received her job offer. She immediately reached for her phone and called the customer service number printed at the bottom of the page. After navigating through the automated menu, a representative answered, "Thank you for calling Desert Valley Electric. My name is Rachel. How may I help you today?" "Hi, I'm calling because I think there may have been a mistake." "What seems to be the problem?" "My balance says it's been paid." "May I verify your account?" Dorothy provided the information. A few moments of typing followed. "I see the payment. Who made it?" "I'm sorry, ma'am. The payment was made in person, but the customer requested to remain anonymous." Dorothy smiled faintly. "I thought you might say that. Is there anything else I can help you with today?" "No." She looked once more at the paper. "You already have." She ended the call. Anonymous. Her first thought was Samuel. Her second was Rebecca. Neither seemed likely. Both respected her dignity too much to quietly solve her problems without asking. She folded the letter and slipped it carefully inside Angela's old recipe box where she kept important papers. Not because of the money, because one day she wanted Ethan to see it. Sometimes gratitude deserved to be remembered. The following Monday marked Dorothy's first official day as an outbound coordination supervisor. She arrived 20 minutes early, not because anyone expected it, because Angela had always believed that arriving early was a way of respecting other people's time. Carl Jenkins spotted her from across Dock 2. He grinned. "Well?" He pointed toward the new Navy supervisor shirt she wore. "They finally gave you the fancy badge." Dorothy laughed. "I think the badge is fancier than I am." Carl walked over. "You still carrying that old thermos?" She lifted it slightly. "Every day." "I was hoping you'd say that." He nodded toward the warehouse. "Come on. The crew's waiting." The morning meeting felt different now. These weren't simulated assignments. Every shipment represented real businesses, real hospitals, real families, real deadlines. Dorothy looked around the room before speaking. "I'm still learning." Several employees exchanged surprised glances. "If you see something I miss," she smiled, "tell me." Nobody expected a supervisor to begin that way. Carl certainly didn't. After the meeting ended, he quietly caught up with her. "You know why people listened." "I hope because they trust me." "Not yet," she laughed. "Fair enough." "They listened because you didn't pretend to know everything." He smiled. "That's rarer than you think." By lunchtime, Dorothy had already solved 3 scheduling issues, helped unload an unexpected shipment herself, when staffing ran short, and learned the names of every employee on her shift. She believed names mattered. Angela had once told her, "People work harder for someone who remembers who they are." That afternoon, Rebecca invited Dorothy into her office. "I've been watching." Dorothy smiled nervously. "I hope that's good." "It is." Rebecca slid a folder across the desk. Inside were proposals for employee wellness initiatives, transportation assistance, emergency childcare, financial education, food pantry partnerships. Rebecca folded her hands. "I'd like your opinion." "My opinion?" "You've lived challenges many executives only read about." Dorothy looked through the pages carefully. The proposals were thoughtful, helpful, yet something felt missing. After several minutes, she looked up. "Can I be honest? I'd be disappointed if you weren't." Dorothy nodded. These solve problems after people ask for help. Rebecca waited. What if we made asking easier? Rebecca leaned forward. Go on. Dorothy thought carefully before answering. When I was struggling, she looked towards the warehouse floor. The hardest part wasn't being poor. Rebecca listened closely. It was feeling embarrassed every time I needed something. Silence settled between them. What if we created one place where nobody had to explain? Rebecca's curiosity deepened. What would that look like? Dorothy smiled. I'm not completely sure yet. But I keep thinking about my mother. The thermos? Dorothy nodded. She never asked whether someone deserved the second cup. She just poured it. Rebecca reached for a notebook. Keep talking. Ideas began flowing naturally. A shelf near the employee entrance, coffee, bottled water, bus passes, winter gloves for colder months, shelf-stable snacks, information about local housing assistance, mental health resources, job training opportunities, no paperwork, no interviews, no permission required. Take what you need. Leave what you can. Rebecca stopped writing. I like this. Dorothy hesitated. It might be too simple. Rebecca smiled. The best ideas usually are. Within 2 weeks, the project began taking shape. Employees volunteered old books. Someone donated children's backpacks. A local bakery agreed to provide unsold bread every Friday morning. The city's transit authority offered discounted emergency bus vouchers. Even Carl quietly appeared one afternoon carrying 3 heavy boxes. Dorothy looked inside. Brand new work gloves, steel-toe socks, reflective winter hats. You bought all this? Carl shrugged. I've had steady work for 23 years. He smiled awkwardly. Figured somebody else ought to have a good first week, too. Word spread quickly through Horizon Freight. Nobody officially named the small corner near the break room. One morning, Dorothy arrived to find a handwritten sign taped neatly above the shelves. Warm Hands Corner. She stopped walking. The letters were written in a thick black marker. Simple, uneven, beautiful. She looked around. Who did this? Nobody answered. Several employees smiled without saying a word. Rebecca eventually walked over carrying another cardboard box. You'll want these. Inside sat dozens of disposable coffee cups. Dorothy laughed. I think we're going to need more coffee. Rebecca looked toward Angela's old thermos resting on the counter. I was thinking, she hesitated. What if that stayed here during every shift? Dorothy instinctively placed a hand on the thermos. For a moment, she wasn't sure. It had followed her through nearly half her life. Then she remembered something Angela had once whispered after giving away her favorite winter scarf. If you keep every treasure locked away. It eventually belongs to fear. Dorothy slowly unscrewed the thermos. She filled 2 fresh paper cups. One she kept. The other she placed beside the new sign. Warm Hands Corner. Within 10 minutes, a young warehouse worker quietly picked up the second cup before heading outside to begin his shift. He never knew the story behind the old scratched thermos. He simply smiled after the first sip. Dorothy watched from across the room. Her mother had been gone for 12 years. Yet somehow, another pair of cold hands had just been warmed by the same quiet tradition. Later that evening, as Dorothy prepared to leave, Samuel Walker stopped beside the shelf. He looked at the coffee, the bus vouchers, the gloves, the small basket labeled, "Take what you need." He remained silent for a long time. Finally, he looked at Dorothy. You know. What? I spent 35 years trying to build a successful company. He smiled gently. You built something people will remember in less than 3 weeks. Dorothy shook her head. I didn't build it. Samuel glanced toward the old thermos. No. His voice softened. I suppose Angela just found another place to pour the second cup? Dorothy looked at the shelf one last time before switching off the break room lights. She didn't notice the young woman standing quietly near the warehouse entrance watching the Warm Hands corner, with tired eyes, a worn backpack over one shoulder, and uncertainty written across her face. By the following night, that young woman would walk through the door, carrying nothing but hope, and Dorothy would recognize a version of herself she thought she had left behind forever. Rain was rare in Phoenix, but on Thursday evening, dark clouds rolled across the desert sky, and a steady rain fell just as the afternoon shift ended. Employees hurried toward their cars with jackets over their heads. Forklifts were parked. Loading docks closed one by one. The warehouse slowly settled into its evening rhythm. Dorothy Thompson remained behind to finish paperwork. She had developed a habit of walking through every department before leaving, not to inspect, to notice. Angela had once told her that the easiest way to lose people was to stop seeing them, so Dorothy greeted the security guards by name. She asked the janitorial staff if they needed anything. She thanked the mechanics repairing loading equipment long after most office employees had gone home. Those conversations lasted only seconds, but they mattered. As she passed the employee break room, she glanced toward the Warm Hands corner. Most of the coffee had been taken. Only 3 bus passes remained. 2 pairs of gloves, a few granola bars. Someone had left several cans of soup. Another employee had quietly added children's coloring books. No one signed their name. That made Dorothy smile. Kindness had started traveling on its own. She bent down to straighten one of the baskets. Then she noticed movement near the hallway entrance. A young woman stood there soaking wet despite standing under the roof overhang. She couldn't have been older than 26 or 27. Her jeans were damp from the rain. A faded backpack hung loosely from one shoulder. Her sneakers were badly worn, with the edges beginning to separate from the soles. She wasn't looking at the food. She wasn't looking at the coffee. She was staring at the sign. Warm Hands Corner. Her expression carried something Dorothy recognized immediately. Not hunger, embarrassment. The kind that kept people from taking help, even when they desperately needed it. Dorothy pretended to organize the shelf for another minute, giving the woman time. The young woman took one hesitant step forward, then another. She reached toward a bus pass. Stopped. Looked around. Pulled her hand back. Dorothy remembered doing exactly the same thing years earlier inside a church food pantry. She had left without taking anything because accepting help had somehow felt heavier than carrying the struggle home. She walked over slowly. Hi. The young woman startled. I'm sorry. You don't have to apologize. I wasn't stealing. I know. Silence settled between them. My name's Dorothy. The young woman looked down. Lisa. It's nice to meet you, Lisa. Another pause. Dorothy didn't ask why she was there. She didn't ask if she had a job. She didn't ask whether she deserved help. Instead, she reached for Angela's thermos. You look cold. Lisa hesitated. I don't want to take someone else's coffee. Dorothy smiled gently. That's exactly who it's for. She poured a cup and offered it. Lisa accepted it carefully, as though afraid it might disappear. The warmth immediately spread through her fingers. She closed her eyes for just a second. I forgot what hot coffee feels like. Dorothy heard the sentence more than she heard the words. People didn't forget the taste of coffee. They forgot the feeling of being able to stop long enough to enjoy it. They sat together at one of the small break room tables. Rain tapped softly against the windows. Neither woman rushed to speak. Eventually, Lisa whispered, I had a job interview today. How did it go? I don't know, Dorothy smiled. That's usually not a bad sign. Lisa laughed quietly. They said they'd call. I hope they do. So do I. She stared into the coffee. My motel room was paid through this morning. Dorothy listened without interrupting. I thought I'd get the job. Her voice cracked. I packed everything before the interview because I didn't think I'd be going back. The backpack beside her chair suddenly made sense. I've been walking ever since. Dorothy felt an ache in her chest. Not because Lisa reminded her of herself, because she reminded her of how close she had come to giving up before someone simply believed she deserved a chance. Have you eaten today? Lisa looked embarrassed. I had crackers. What time? She looked at the clock. I think around 9. Dorothy quietly stood and walked to the employee refrigerator. Someone had left several wrapped turkey sandwiches for the evening shift. She returned with one. Lisa shook her head immediately. I can't. Why? They're for employees. Dorothy smiled. I'm an employee. Lisa looked confused. I'm sharing mine. For several seconds, Lisa simply stared. Then she whispered, Thank you. She ate slowly. Not because she wasn't hungry, because she was trying not to appear hungry. Dorothy had seen that before, too. When the sandwich was gone, Lisa carefully folded the wrapper into a tiny square before throwing it away. Even her gratitude carried dignity. Dorothy admired that. So, Dorothy asked gently, What kind of work do you do? I've done a little of everything. Retail? Reception? Warehouse packing? She smiled apologetically. I never stayed anywhere very long. Why not? Lisa hesitated, then answered honestly. My mom got sick. I kept leaving jobs to take care of her. Dorothy nodded. And now, she passed away last winter. I'm so sorry. Lisa swallowed hard. After the funeral, I couldn't keep up with rent. The words came quietly, not dramatically, just truth. Dorothy recognized another familiar feeling. Shame often whispered. It rarely shouted. Just then, Rebecca Collins entered the break room carrying a folder. She stopped when she saw Lisa. Dorothy stood. Rebecca. Rebecca looked from Dorothy to Lisa. Everything okay? Dorothy nodded. I think so. She briefly explained. Rebecca listened carefully without interrupting. Then she turned toward Lisa. Would you mind answering one question? Lisa looked nervous. Okay. What time was your interview today? 10. Rebecca frowned slightly. With Desert Valley Distribution? Lisa blinked. Yes. You interviewed with my friend. Lisa looked surprised. You know her? Rebecca smiled. I know the hiring manager. Lisa's eyes widened. I didn't get the job. They haven't chosen anyone yet. Hope flickered across Lisa's face for the first time. Rebecca continued. Whether they hire you or not. She reached into her folder. Horizon starts another warehouse training class next month. Lisa looked confused. I don't have experience. Rebecca glanced toward Dorothy. We've learned that experience isn't always the first thing worth looking at. Dorothy smiled, but said nothing. Rebecca handed Lisa a brochure. No promises? No shortcuts. Just an opportunity. Lisa stared at the paper with trembling hands. I don't even know what to say. Dorothy quietly answered for her. You don't have to. Rain continued falling outside. For several minutes, nobody spoke. 3 women sat around a small table. One had once been invisible. One had spent years learning to see. One was standing where the other had once stood. As Lisa prepared to leave, Dorothy walked her to the entrance. She reached into the basket at the warm hands corner. 1 bus pass, 1 pair of dry socks, a small notebook. Then, almost as an afterthought, she picked up a folded envelope. Inside was exactly $8. The emergency cash employees had begun contributing for anyone stranded without transportation. Dorothy smiled to herself. The number still seemed to find her. She handed the envelope to Lisa. Lisa immediately tried to refuse. I can't. Dorothy gently closed Lisa's fingers around it. Years ago, she smiled softly, someone taught me that $8 can be much bigger than $8. Lisa looked at her in confusion. I'll pay it back. Dorothy shook her head. No. She pointed toward the warm hands corner. When you're able, she paused. Leave something there for someone you've never met. Lisa looked back at the shelf, then at the old thermos, then at Dorothy. Tears filled her eyes. I promise. Dorothy watched as Lisa stepped into the rain carrying the backpack, the bus passed the small envelope, and perhaps something even more important. The belief that tomorrow might still be different. As the doors closed behind her, Samuel, who had witnessed the entire conversation from the hallway without interrupting quietly, whispered to himself, "The second cup found another pair of hands." He smiled. The circle Angela Thompson had started decades earlier had grown larger than any of them could have imagined. And Dorothy was no longer simply continuing her mother's kindness. She was helping it become someone else's beginning. Autumn slipped quietly into winter. Phoenix never wore heavy snow like cities farther north, but the mornings became crisp enough that warm coffee disappeared from the warm hands corner almost as soon as Dorothy filled the cups. What had begun with a single shelf near the break room had slowly transformed into something no one at Horizon Freight had planned. Every Monday, someone left fresh fruit. Every Wednesday, a local bakery delivered day-old bread that was still warm. On Fridays, a retired mechanic dropped off repaired bicycles for employees' children. No one organized it. No committee managed it. People simply noticed a need and quietly answered it. Dorothy often smiled when she thought about that. Goodness rarely spread because someone announced it. It spread because someone made it look possible. 3 months after Dorothy accepted her supervisor position, Rebecca Collins walked into her office carrying a cream-colored envelope. You've become difficult to schedule. Dorothy looked up from a stack of shipping reports. I hope that's not a complaint. Rebecca laughed. It depends. She handed over the envelope. Samuel Walker, retirement celebration, Saturday, 2:00 p.m., main distribution center. Dorothy looked surprised. Already? Rebecca nodded. He kept delaying retirement. Why? He always said there was one more person he wanted to mentor. Rebecca smiled knowingly. So, I think he finally found that person. Dorothy lowered her eyes. I still have so much to learn. Rebecca leaned against the doorframe. That's probably why he chose you. Saturday afternoon arrived beneath a clear Arizona sky. The largest warehouse had been transformed. Forklifts were parked outside. Long tables covered with white cloth stretched across the loading floor. Employees from every department gathered together. Current workers, retirees, truck drivers, maintenance crews, office staff, even families. Children ran between tables while older employees exchanged stories from decades past. Dorothy arrived with Ethan, both carrying homemade peach cobbler, Angela's recipe. Carl Jenkins spotted them immediately. Now it's officially a party, Ethan laughed. Because of the cobbler? Carl nodded solemnly. I've been waiting all week. The celebration began with laughter, photographs, and stories that made everyone realize how many lives Samuel Walker had quietly influenced over 35 years. One former employee stood. I came here after getting out of prison. Samuel had given him a second chance. Another woman remembered arriving as a frightened 19-year-old single mother. Samuel had rearranged her schedule so she could finish community college. A truck driver recalled losing his home after a fire. Several co-workers quietly rebuilt it over one weekend, after Samuel simply asked whether anyone could help. Again and again the stories shared the same pattern. Samuel had never rescued people. He had simply opened doors. Rebecca eventually stepped onto the small stage assembled near the loading docks. She tapped the microphone gently. If I tried to list everything Samuel Walker accomplished, she smiled toward him, we'd still be here next Tuesday. Laughter rippled through the crowd. So instead, she paused, I'd like someone else to speak. Dorothy looked around curiously. Rebecca turned toward her. Dorothy. For a second, she genuinely believed Rebecca meant another Dorothy. Then Ethan nudged her gently. Mom. Every eye in the warehouse turned toward her. Dorothy quietly stood. I didn't prepare anything. Rebecca smiled. That's exactly why I asked you. The walk to the stage felt much longer than it really was. She wasn't afraid of public speaking. She was afraid of saying too little or too much. Standing before nearly 300 people, she looked first at Samuel, then at the workers, then at the old thermos sitting on a small display table beside several photographs from Samuel's career. Rebecca had placed it there without telling her. Dorothy smiled. I've been thinking, her voice carried easily through the warehouse, about how strange life can be. The room grew quiet. A few months ago, I was cleaning floors at the airport. I thought invisible people stayed invisible forever. She glanced toward Samuel. Then, one cold night, she stopped herself. Most people expected the famous story about $8. Instead, she shook her head. Actually, she smiled softly. This story didn't begin that night. It began decades earlier. She picked up the thermos. My mother worked hard. She taught me something I didn't understand until she was gone. She looked around the room. Every night she filled enough coffee for 2 people. Several older employees exchanged surprised glances. One whispered, Angela. Dorothy continued. She always said, she smiled through gathering tears, warm hands make brave hearts. Silence filled the warehouse. I thought that was just something she told me. She looked toward Samuel. Then I learned she had been saying it here too. Samuel lowered his head. His eyes were already wet. Dorothy continued. I've been asked several times why I gave away my last $8. She looked across the crowd. The truth is, I wasn't trying to change someone's life. I was simply trying not to forget who my mother had taught me to become. She paused. And then something happened that changed how I think about kindness forever. The room remained perfectly still. I discovered that generosity doesn't disappear when the person who started it is gone. She gently rested one hand on the thermos. It keeps traveling. From one life into another. Until one day, she looked toward the warm hands corner visible across the warehouse. You realize it doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to everyone willing to carry it. No applause came immediately, only silence. The kind created when people weren't merely listening, they were remembering. Dorothy looked toward Samuel. You once gave my mother an opportunity. Without knowing, she smiled gently, that years later she would teach me how to recognize one. She stepped closer to him. And then you did the same for me. Samuel slowly stood. For several seconds, neither moved. Then he embraced Dorothy like family. The warehouse erupted into applause. Many employees openly wiped away tears. Even Carl pretended to study the floor for a while. Marcus Reed stood near the back beside Olivia Chen. He shook his head slowly. I spent half my life thinking leadership meant people noticing you. Olivia smiled. And now, I think, he laughed quietly, it means noticing people. Rebecca stepped back to the microphone. I have one final announcement. The applause faded. Beginning next month, she pointed toward the warm hands corner. That program will officially become part of every Horizon freight location in Arizona. Gasps spread through the crowd. We'll call it, she looked toward Dorothy, the Second Cup Initiative. Dorothy immediately shook her head. No. Rebecca looked surprised. No, Dorothy smiled. It shouldn't be named after me. It isn't. Rebecca nodded toward the thermos. It's named after the choice. Everyone applauded again. Samuel quietly whispered, Angela would have loved that. After the celebration ended, people lingered long after sunset. Children played between warehouse aisles. Co-workers laughed over homemade desserts. Before leaving, Marcus walked over to Dorothy. I've accepted a promotion. Congratulations. I almost turned it down. She looked surprised. Why? I wasn't sure I was ready. And now, he smiled, I remembered something you told me. Dorothy frowned. What was that? Confused people don't need another confused voice. She laughed. I said that. You did. He extended his hand. Thank you. As Dorothy and Ethan walked toward the parking lot, Ethan slipped his small hand into hers. Mom? Yes. Do you think Grandma can see all this? Dorothy looked back through the warehouse windows. Employees were still gathered around the warm hands corner. Someone had already poured 2 fresh cups of coffee. She smiled softly. I think... She squeezed Ethan's hand. She's probably wondering why it took us so long to understand what she started. Neither of them noticed a young woman in a Horizon freight training uniform stepping through the front doors carrying a familiar faded backpack. Lisa Carter had returned, and she wasn't there to ask for help. She was there for her first day of training. 1 year later, the bus stop outside Phoenix Sky Harbor Airport looked almost exactly the same. The metal bench still carried scratches from years of weather. The streetlight above it still flickered every few minutes before settling into a steady glow. The city buses still arrived a little late, more often than anyone wanted. Travelers still hurried past with rolling suitcases. Most of them never noticed the little wooden cabinet standing quietly beside the shelter. It wasn't large, just tall enough to reach an adult's waist. Its cedar wood had been carefully sanded and sealed against the desert sun. A simple brass plaque rested on the front. Warm Hands Box. Take what you need, leave what you can. No cameras watched over it. No lock protected it. No one asked questions. Inside were a few bus passes, bottles of water, granola bars, travel-size toiletries, phone charging cables, and several handwritten cards filled with encouraging words from strangers who would probably never meet the people reading them. Every evening, before beginning her shift, Dorothy Thompson stopped there for a few minutes. It had become another quiet ritual. She unlocked the little cabinet with a small brass key, refilled the coffee container, straightened the shelves, checked expiration dates, replaced whatever had been taken during the day. On this particular evening, she reached into her coat pocket and removed a small white envelope. She smiled before placing it carefully inside the wooden box. Across the front, she had written only 4 words. If today is hard. Inside the envelope rested exactly $8. Nothing more, nothing less. She never left 10, never 20, always 8. Beside the envelope, she placed Angela's old thermos. Not permanently, only until midnight. Every evening, she filled it with fresh coffee before leaving it beside a stack of paper cups. 1 cup for herself, 1 for whoever arrived next. The tradition had outgrown her, just as Samuel had predicted years earlier. Dorothy closed the cabinet doors and quietly walked toward the airport employee entrance. She had nearly reached the security gate when she heard footsteps behind her. Miss Thompson! She turned. A familiar young woman hurried toward her, Lisa Carter. Only now she looked completely different. Her faded backpack had been replaced by a company-issued messenger bag. She wore a Horizon freight training jacket with her name embroidered neatly above the pocket. Her posture was straighter, her smile steadier. I hoped I'd catch you. Dorothy embraced her warmly. How are classes going? Lisa laughed. They're harder than you warned me. I told you they would be. You also told me not to quit on the days I wanted to. And I've wanted to quit 5 times. Only 5. Lisa laughed harder. So far. They stood together beside the bus shelter. Lisa glanced toward the warm hands box. I came early. I noticed. I left something. Dorothy looked through the small glass window built into the cabinet door. On the second shelf rested a neatly folded pair of women's work gloves. Beside them sat 2 unopened notebooks and a grocery gift card. Lisa smiled shyly. I remembered my promise. Dorothy looked at her with quiet pride. You kept it. I almost forgot, Lisa admitted. Life finally became busy again. She paused. Then I remembered the envelope. The one with $8. Dorothy nodded. Lisa's voice softened. I kept the envelope. You did? I spent the money. She laughed. I had to. But I still have the envelope. She reached into her bag and carefully removed it. The paper had become worn around the edges. Across the front, Dorothy's handwriting remained visible. If today is hard. Lisa smiled through tears. I read those words every time I think I'm falling behind. Dorothy gently squeezed her hand. They still helping? Every day. At exactly 11:58 p.m., a city bus pulled away from the curb. The same time, the same place, the same hour where everything had changed 1 year earlier. As the bus disappeared into the darkness, another figure slowly approached the shelter. A young father carrying a sleeping little girl. His clothes were clean but worn. His face showed the unmistakable exhaustion of someone who had been solving impossible problems for too long. He stopped in front of the warm hands box, read the sign, looked around, then quietly opened the small door. He hesitated before touching anything. Dorothy recognized that hesitation immediately. It looked exactly like Lisa's. Exactly like her own. The man removed a bus pass, then noticed the white envelope. He opened it carefully. $8. Nothing more, nothing less. For several seconds, he simply stared. His shoulders trembled. Not because of the money, because somebody he had never met had somehow anticipated exactly what he needed. His little daughter stirred sleepily against his shoulder. Daddy. It's okay. He kissed her forehead. We're going home. Dorothy watched from a respectful distance. She never approached. Some moments belonged only to the people living them. The father carefully placed something back inside the cabinet before leaving. After the bus carried them away, Dorothy walked over. On the shelf beside the empty envelope rested a folded piece of paper. She opened it. Thank you. I only needed the bus pass. Someone else may need this more. Inside the note remained the untouched $8. Dorothy smiled, then laughed quietly to herself. The circle had become even larger than she realized. She returned the money to the envelope, closed the cabinet, picked up Angela's thermos. As she turned toward the airport, her phone vibrated. A message from Ethan, now 16 years old. He had started volunteering every Saturday at the Learning Center without ever being asked. His text contained a single photograph. A little boy sat at a table holding a steaming paper cup of hot chocolate. The caption beneath the picture read, "He was cold. Now he isn't. Love you, Mom." Dorothy looked at the photo for a long time. Then she typed only 3 words. Love you too. She slipped the phone back into her pocket and walked toward the employee entrance. Inside the airport, travelers hurried in every direction. Some were celebrating. Some were grieving. Some were beginning new chapters. Others were saying goodbye. Most would never notice the woman quietly wiping fingerprints from the glass near the entrance. Even after becoming a supervisor, Dorothy still volunteered one evening each month to work alongside the airport cleaning crew. Not because she had to, because she never wanted to forget what it felt like to be invisible. Rosa Martinez spotted her immediately. You keep coming back, Dorothy laughed. I told you. What? I like leaving places a little better than I found them. Rosa handed her a spray bottle. You sound just like your mother. Dorothy smiled. I finally understand why. Outside beneath the old bus stop light, the Warm Hands box waited patiently for the next stranger who believed no one could possibly see them. Inside rested a fresh envelope. Exactly $8. A warm thermos of coffee, and one handwritten card. Warm hands make brave hearts. The handwriting was no longer Angela's. It wasn't Dorothy's either. It belonged to Ethan. The words had found another generation. And perhaps that had always been the real miracle. Not that $8 changed a life, but that one quiet act of kindness kept teaching ordinary people how to become extraordinary for someone else. Sometimes we think generosity begins when we finally have enough money, enough time, or enough security. But the truth is, kindness often begins when we choose compassion, despite our own uncertainty. Dorothy didn't know whether the stranger was telling the truth. She didn't know that her $8 would lead to a new opportunity. She certainly didn't expect her mother's quiet habits to return decades later through people she had never met. She simply chose to become the kind of person she wanted her son to remember. The greatest acts of kindness are rarely the loudest. They are the extra cup of coffee, the patient conversation, the second chance the hand extended without demanding proof that someone deserves it. Those small choices create ripples that travel farther than we will ever see. Long after we are gone, someone else may continue the kindness we began. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you're watching from, and what small act of kindness has stayed with you throughout your life. Your story may encourage someone who needs hope today. If you enjoy heartfelt stories about courage, compassion, and second chances, don't forget to share this video with someone you care about and subscribe so you won't miss our next journey together.